Yeah, I think in a way I'm privileged that, working in a school, I can see what's happening day to day and actually have the lived experience from, I suppose, for want of a better word, the front line. Um, and what I wanted to start off with, and what I focused on at the beginning of this policy briefing, was blended learning is this thing here. It's a purposefully designed combination of in-class and remote learning. Remote can be at home, but it does mean outside of school. And there is a huge amount of provision that we as schools and also youth organisations offer, which is remote already. But the actual blended approach is where we purposely design both parts. It doesn't have to be digital when remote, but obviously that's what we've seen an awful lot of recently. However, ERE, or emergency remote education, is not the same as blended learning. This is what we did. We sort of acted very quickly as a result of a crisis. ERE is that sudden move to remote learning. March 2020, a few days notice, we had to rapidly develop something that would work for our students in our context. And what the research is starting to show is that there are positives from ERE that mirror the positives seen in blended learning research. However, a lot of blended research or learning research hasn't actually focused on compulsory school age provision. So blended learning as a true concept of blended learning has to be purposely planned. And we can't emphasize that enough. It can include synchronous and asynchronous remote learning, so at the same time or at a different time. It is teacher guided. It isn't traditionally very common in compulsory education, but things like flipped learning has started to become a thing in recent years. And it's not the same as just setting a homework, which is usually, although not always, but it is usually an extension of the class learning. So when I started looking at the research, there's quite a lot of research-informed benefits for blended learning in terms of higher education. And some of those things you can sort of immediately see, well, actually, this might work in secondary schools and primary schools as well, and further ed. So there's more classroom time for active pedagogy. So you can actually do more with your teaching and learning if the students are also benefiting from that blended approach. There's more classroom time for things like collaboration. There's more opportunities for peer interactions. There's more opportunity for self-directed learning. And also that opportunity to learn at a time and a pace to suit each learner individually. And as we move into curriculum for Wales, and the idea of that being context specific and every opportunity being given to every learner as an individual, then blended learning really starts to look like something we should be looking into a little bit more. The EEF did their rapid evidence review in 2020. It's important to note with this that this is based on research prior to COVID. So this is based on research on blended learning, not emergency remote education. And that idea of access to technology, supporting pupils to work independently, the different approaches for different people, peer interactions. But fundamentally, it's that top point, isn't it? It's the teaching quality is more important than whether the lessons are synchronous or asynchronous. And that quality of teaching and learning has to come through. It comes through in the schools, it comes through in classrooms. It is what is important. And if we're going to move forward with a blended teaching and learning approach, then that teaching quality has to be first and foremost. So Graham 2019 talked about those competencies that we need. So the technological, pedagogical, and assessment. We need to understand metacognition. We need to think about how we scaffold that independence. We need to think about our collaborative learning environment, what we're actually going to use to do that, and how we're also going to do feedback. We have in Wales a digital competency framework for both students and staff, and we need to think about that though more in terms of actually what else do students and staff need to be technologically ready to do blended learning. There's also the idea of the universal design for learning principles and then the new pedagogies that will be part of that. There's the SLO model in Wales, the Schools as Learning Organisations model, which should be underpinning an awful lot of work in schools now, and the implications then for professional learning and also for initial teacher education. So that quality of provision is absolutely essential. The second sort of area that was found is this, the digital divide, the equity of provision. Now, Hub and the DCF are already in place in Wales, and research has shown that pre-investment in infrastructure is invaluable. Countries where there was pre-investment in infrastructure and platforms such as Hub actually found a better response rate to moving to emergency remote education, and also find a better response rate to blended learning opportunities. The connectivity for staff and for students, that 50 million plus that was invested by Welsh Government with devices and connection. For my own school, it was invaluable to say to children, yes, here you are, have a device. Parent confidence is really important. Wizard study 2021, their lessons in lockdown study, 70% of parents that they researched found that they were rarely supporting their students. Now, their research was upper Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3 and 4, but parents were rarely supporting the home-based provision. Now, we need to work out why that is if we want to move forward with a true blended approach in the future. Is it lack of parental knowledge? Is it parental time? Is it that they had their own work-life balance to consider? What is it that affects that figure? That's a massive figure. Also, the NFER 2020 study found that there was 20% difference between those students with who we consider more advantaged and less advantaged, those that are pupil deprivation grant students. It does affect all students and families, but there is an increasing digital divide between those families who are in disadvantage. We also need to look at the specific learner groups in terms of our blended approaches. Face-to-face is vital. It really is. We can't replace schools, but the remote aspect can actually support these learners who struggle. We have students in schools and in further education who struggle with coming to school, the anxiety. We also have young carers, young mums, those who we would say are educated other than at school. Disaffected learners, disengaged learners, traveller communities, remote communities, those with autism or additional learning needs. Interestingly, there's research on both sides of the coin for those with autism, particularly some who have found that for students with autism, the lack of stress of a school environment has been positive. Others have found the unclear boundaries between school and home has made this period quite negative for them. So what are we going to do if we move forward with a blended approach to ensure that we have the equity of provision? And are we going to be thinking about blended approaches in terms of where we go now, or are we going to be thinking of them just as a provision for lockdown or isolation periods? This came up in Manon's session as well, and also in the feedback session just now. That student well-being, that first and foremost, there are positives and negatives starting to be shared from studies during emergency remote education. 90% of students miss their contact with their friends and their teachers. 90% actually miss that because it wasn't the normal situation for them, and it was more than just not being in school. There are some students who found a reduced anxiety of not having to get up and come into school every day. But there are other students, conversely, who were more anxious about progress. 54% in a Commissioner for Wales study found that they were anxious about the progress. Is that down to the way that we are promoting this? And again, coming back to that idea of, is this down to the language that we're using? Safeguarding concerns, we're not noticing some safeguarding concerns because of the amount of time that students spend in school. So if we're moving towards looking at blended teaching approaches as more than just emergency education, what do we need to put in place for safeguarding concerns? The Welsh Government put forward their Stay Safe, Stay Learning policy, and in it, very briefly, has talked about this 5 ways to wellbeing model. We've also got in the new curriculum for Wales, the health and wellbeing AOLE. That needs to be front and centre of what we are doing, whether we're looking at the in-school provision, but particularly if we're looking at the blended provision as well, and the education other than in front of a teacher in a classroom. So from the policy briefing, from the research around it, we came up with some recommendations. And the first and foremost is that digital equity is vital. The second were around blended teaching. It's not what has been done in lockdown. It does present opportunities for learners, and it needs to be underpinned by the universal design for learning principles. There is a big job of work to be done moving forward in professional learning in that case. There are some specific learner groups from mainstream schooling who benefit from blended teaching and learning, and we need to capitalise on that. And they also need to develop age-appropriate independent learning skills. That is absolutely fundamental. Couple of questions for consideration as we move forward then. So how can we use the schools as learning organisations model to support school development, professional learning? How can the curriculum for Wales impact some of these changes? So the pedagogies, the new curriculum, how do we plan for blended provision? How do we have our wellbeing focus? What about rural area provision? And then finally, how can we use this research to inform the policy and the practice? So what are the current examples? What's out there? What are the barriers? And what do schools and the middle tier now need to move on further?